Seeing the idea of being confined in one place where they would not have the chance to walk in the open for a year.
I like the idea of being locked up in the cave and spying on the Germans. Because in that cave, of course, I had a perfect view of both Gibraltar harbour on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. And I could spot all the German ships coming and going. And then I had a long cable which I dropped out of one of the portholes to which I could communicate with the Admiralty. I didn't feel scared or frightened, I felt excited.
All the members of the tracer team had been allocated different postings in the base in order to go unnoticed.
My undercover job here in Gibraltar was medical officer of health. If the word Tracy was mentioned, it would mean that I would have to go up to the cave and stay there indefinitely.
Soon after the team's arrival, the 3 officers were taken to the tracer complex.
I had this room at the back of the hotel, and these army personnel came in and told me that I was going up to the cave, and I would have to wear an army uniform, which they produced for me, and be dressed as a soldier to get through the security barrier up at the rock.
During several months, the members of the tracer team led a life similar to that of any member of the Gibraltar garrison. They complied with their duties in their respective postings, and during their free time, they visited the nearby villages of La Linea, Algeciras, and San Roque. While on duty on the rock, they suffered a bombing by the Italian 4-engined planes of the Bruno Mussolini squadron and learnt about the submarine attacks carried out by the manned torpedoes of the Ossa Maggiore flotilla. This flotilla operated from the Italian merchant ship Altera, which was anchored in the Algeciras dock. The rest of them just confined themselves to the monotony of life on the base.
I did think at the time that I would be wearing my naval uniform, which indicated that I was a doctor. And if the Germans were honourable gentlemen, I would have been all right. But I realised that the Germans may not have been ordinary gentlemen, and that if I was a spy, they would have shot me.
Throughout 1942, a series of events which were of special importance for the development of the war took place in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. Meanwhile, the tracer members stayed in Gibraltar waiting to be activated.
Through time, as I got involved in local history, and I managed to befriend a family who their father was one of the officers in intelligence involved in the operations in that Tracer or Monkeys case operation. I found out that through the documents they gave me a set of plans of a cave which seems to be bigger than the one up recognized as Tracer Cave. I can tell you that the one of the officers that was from the Royal Navy, by the name Lieutenant Collins Vaughan, he was one of the gents involved, but unfortunately getting information out of those individuals was an impossibility.
In the north of Africa, Rommel had started the year with a new offensive that made the British retreat to the Egyptian border. It was a brave blow that would be followed by an equally amazing one, which would take him to the gates of Alexandria, where all the invested effort ended up with his supplies. The British took advantage of that moment to launch the powerful counter-offensive that would finally mean the beginning of the end to the Axis' presence in Africa. Furthermore, using Gibraltar as an advanced foothold, the North Americans would finally join the Western theatre of operations and disembark in French Morocco in the same rearguards as Rommel's. The centralisation of assets in the colony, the vital use of its airfield to support the aerial coverage of the operation, and the frenetic activity of those days in the whole base could not remain unnoticed for the tracer members stationed on the rock. It is true that the Germans seemed to be culminating their summer offensive in Russia with the seizure of Stalingrad, although the general feeling was that everything was beginning to go well for the Allies. This feeling had become true before the ending of the winter 1942-43. By the Volga, the German spearhead in the south of Russia had been destroyed in a disaster of strategic proportions, which was about to defeat the whole Eastern Front, while in the north of Africa, the remains of the formerly proud Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in mid-May. But beyond all these major adversities, it was the Wehrmacht defeat in the plains of Kursk that irreversibly confirmed the inclinations in favour of the Allies. In the Mediterranean, the North Americans and the British got ready for lambing into what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. On the 10th of June 1943, they disembarked in Sicily, and around mid-August they had taken control of the island. Since the days of Operation Torch, the Allies had offered Spain some guarantees, and the Germans could just allow themselves some defensive-related plans with regard to the peninsula. It is true that in several opportunities Gibraltar was mentioned again, but this never came true. At the end of the spring of 1943, the risk of losing control of the Mediterranean key points had virtually disappeared. All these factors caused the implementation of Operation Tracer in Gibraltar to lose much of its purpose. As a matter of fact, on the 24th of August 1943, some days after the triumphant entrance of the American troops in Messina confirmed the defeat of Sicily, the Naval Intelligence Division extended a secret message to the people in charge of Tracer in Gibraltar so that they proceeded to the permanent annulment of the operation, the distribution of the stored supplies, and the closing of the accesses to the underground complex. 53 years had to go by until a group of people passionate about their local history found the place and started to gather the documentation and testimonies that made it possible to rebuild the story. However, there are mysteries that remain unsolved. According to Dr. Cooper's testimony, the image he blurry keeps in his mind from the moment he, together with the officers involved in the operation, in 1942 visited the place which would serve them as shelter, is that of a relatively small room with a tiny opening on one of its walls, from where it was possible to see part of the city and the detached mole. On the opposite side there was another opening, made with a pick, which faced the Mediterranean. However, this chamber did not face any tunnel, did not have any annexed room, and above all, this place was neither below nor close to any artillery battery. This description has led to speculation, since it did not fit that of the complex discovered in 1996. It's possible, although unlikely in light of the available documentation, that the Naval Intelligence Division assigned 2 independent tracer teams to Gibraltar, each one with their own observation post. It's possible that another tracer team was created within the garrison on the initiative of the naval officer responsible for such sector, and following the suggestions pointed out in the well-known manual dispatched from London. It's likely, too, that the naval intelligence would decide to keep the real observation post in secret as a safety measure and in order to avoid any indiscretion, and that they showed the team another place which would be superficially equipped so as to appear convincing. However, above all this, it is clear that the tracer operations were a reality, whose value was recognised both by the Chief of the British Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Sir Alfred Dudley Pickman Rogers Pound. It is also clear that, far from being just a plan, a first tracer team was organised, and its posting was the British colony of Gibraltar, where the chosen place to house them is still preserved. And even though the use of tracer teams was proposed in many other places, Gibraltar was the only place where this operation was certainly deployed and arranged in order to be activated should the situation require it. The data and experiences gathered during the study and training phases made up the content of the manual on which the British Naval Intelligence would later rely to consider the use of these devices. All this information turns the rock into the experimental place of the tracer missions. Fortunately, the evidence of Operation Tracer has reached us through the information stored in the British archives and through the memories of one of its main figures. However, the remains of the device that was buried under the Rock of Gibraltar for half a century constitute the most important piece of evidence. Nowadays, these remains have a huge evocative power and probably hide some other surprise. It's no wonder that with good judgment, the authorities pretend to preserve them. They are clearly aware that these remains constitute a valuable element of the thrilling legacy that the Second World War left to the rock.
I am of the opinion that there is more than one cave in Gibraltar.
In Gibraltar, there are still many mysteries to solve and episodes to document. But as every researcher knows, each door has its key, and with persistence, effort, and some luck, it is certain that, as happened with this case, the key that will bring some light to this matter will eventually be found.